The police called me on a Wednesday night in February at 20 minutes past 11. I was sitting in the kitchen of my apartment in Ghent, reading a technical manual about bridge reinforcement methods, which is the kind of reading that occupies the part of my mind that needs to be occupied in the hours after midnight or the hours before sleep, when the mind is too restless to rest and too tired to do genuine work. I had been reading for 40 minutes. The coffee beside the book was cold. I answered the phone because I always answer the phone regardless of the hour, because 40 years of working in construction in Belgium and the Netherlands means you develop the habit of answering when the phone rings at unusual hours. Because unusual hours are when things go wrong with structures, and structures going wrong is not something you let go to voicemail. The voice said, "Is this Peter van der Meers?" I said, "Yes." The voice said, "This is Inspector Katja Devos of the Ghent Police. I need to ask you to come to the hospital. There has been a death. It concerns your daughter." I said, "I do not have a daughter." There was a pause. The inspector said, "Sir, we have a deceased woman who had identification documents in the name of Emma van der Meers. Your address and phone number were in her wallet as next of kin." I said, "Emma van der Meers is my son's ex-girlfriend. She is not my daughter and she is not deceased. She moved to Amsterdam 2 years ago." Another pause. Inspector Devos said, "Sir, the woman is deceased. I understand this may be confusing. Would you be willing to come to the hospital to assist us with the identification?" I put on my coat. I drove through the empty wet streets of Ghent at 11:30 on a Wednesday in February. The Scheldt was black and still on my left as I crossed the bridge on the Sint Michielsbrug. The city was quiet in the way that cities are quiet at this hour, not silent but resting, a city that has finished its day and has not yet begun the next. I had driven this route 10,000 times. I drove it now with the specific quality of attention that emergency brings when everything is very clear and very immediate and the rest of the world recedes. My name is Peter van der Meers. I am 66 years old. I was born in Ghent in 1958, the son of a steel fitter and a lace maker, which is a combination of manual skill and technical precision that produced in me, through some mechanism I have never fully understood, a structural engineer. I studied at the University of Ghent and worked for 23 years at a large civil engineering firm in Brussels before leaving in 2003 to found my own structural consultancy, Van der Meers Technisch Advies, which over the following 20 years built a reputation in Belgium and the Netherlands for the specific quality of work that I care most about, which is the work of maintaining and rehabilitating old structures rather than building new ones. Bridges particularly, the bridges of Flanders and Brabant and Zeeland, most of which were built in the first half of the 20th century, and which require the specific attention of someone who understands how things were built and why they were built that way and what the passage of time does to the assumptions built into the original design. I have one child. His name is Thomas. He is 38 years old and he is a financial analyst at a bank in Brussels, and he is in the sense that this phrase is used by fathers who love their children without entirely understanding them, the person I am most proud of in the world, and the person who most consistently baffles me. He has his mother's intelligence and his grandfather's ambition, and some quality of his own that I have never found a word for, a quality of moving through the world with a specific kind of smooth efficiency that produces results and relationships and outcomes at a rate that I find slightly dizzying. He was married 3 years ago to a woman named Ingrid Meis from an Antwerp shipping family, and they live in a new apartment in the Ixelles district of Brussels, and they are from what I observe at the monthly Sunday dinners that Thomas organizes with the specific scheduling precision of someone who treats family maintenance as a project, building a life together that is functional and comfortable, and that I genuinely believe makes both of them happy. Emma van der Meers. She had been Thomas's girlfriend for 7 years. They had met at the university in Ghent, and they had been together through the completion of his degree and through his first job in Brussels, and through the early years of building the financial career that now constituted the successful version of his professional life. Emma had been a social work student, and then a social worker, and then a coordinator at a refugee support organization. And then, in the last year of their relationship, I am not entirely certain, because by that point, the relationship had reached the stage at which Thomas did not volunteer much information about Emma, and I did not feel comfortable asking. They separated 4 years ago, when Thomas was 34 and Emma was 32. Thomas told me the separation was mutual. Emma's expression at the last family dinner she attended before the separation, a Christmas dinner at my apartment, had suggested something more complicated than mutual. 2 years ago, as I told the inspector on the phone, she moved to Amsterdam. This I knew because she had called me to say goodbye. Emma had been in the habit of calling me occasionally, not frequently, 3 or 4 times a year, to tell me things about her work or to ask my opinion on a technical matter that had come up in her advocacy work with clients who were dealing with housing issues. I was not her father. She had a father, a man named Frank Dirks, who drove a delivery route in Kortrijk, and who, from what Emma had told me, was present in her life in the irregular way of fathers who love their children but do not know how to express it in a form that the children can receive. I was not her father, but Emma called me 3 or 4 times a year, and I always answered. She called 2 years ago to say she was moving to Amsterdam. A new job at a different refugee organization, one that worked specifically with unaccompanied minors. She sounded well. She sounded, if I am being precise about it, lighter than she had sounded in some time. I said I was glad she had found something good. She said, "Peter, I want to thank you for always answering." I said, "Emma, you are always welcome to call." She said, "I know. That is what I mean." That was the last time I spoke to her. The hospital in Ghent at midnight has the quality that hospitals have at midnight, the specific quality of a place that does not stop but that has slowed to the pace of what cannot be slowed, the serious work, the work that does not respect business hours. Inspector Devos met me at the entrance. She was 40 years old, and she had the face of someone who does difficult work without performing its difficulty, a quality I respect in professionals of all kinds. She shook my hand and said, "Thank you for coming." She said it without the pity that the officer had described in my imagination, and I appreciated this. She led me to a room. A doctor was present. I did not look at the person on the table immediately. I looked at the inspector, and I said, "What do you know?" She said she was found this morning in an apartment in the Vlaamsakei district. 3rd floor. Door was locked from the inside. The neighbor reported not seeing her for 3 days. She said the preliminary finding is cardiac arrest. There were medication bottles in the apartment. She said, "We are treating it as potentially drug-related, but the investigation is ongoing." I said, "How did she die?" The inspector looked at me carefully. She said, "The toxicology will take 2 weeks. At this stage, we do not know." I looked at the person on the table. She was lying, with her face turned slightly to the right. She was covered to the shoulder. The light in the room was clinical and fair. Emma van der Meersch's face was the face I had last seen 2 years before on a Tuesday evening when she had come to my apartment to drop off a book she had borrowed. A book about the Dutch water management systems of the 17th century that we had discussed on the phone the previous month and that she had found at a second-hand bookshop in Amsterdam and had brought on her way through Ghent. She had stayed for coffee. She had looked well, I thought, and she had looked calm in the way that people look calm when they have found the right place for themselves. I had walked her to the door and she had kissed me on the cheek and said she would call when she was settled. She had not called. The face on the table was her face. I said, "Yes, that is Emma Dirks van der Meersch." The inspector wrote something. I said, "She used van der Meersch because I was her emergency contact. Her legal name is Emma Dirks. Her father is Frank Dirks in Kortrijk." She nodded. She said, "We will contact him." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "No." She said, "Do you need to sit down?" I said, "Yes." I sat down. The doctor brought water. I drank it. I said, Inspector, what medication was in the apartment? She said, we are not releasing that information at this stage. I said, I understand. I said, was there anything else in the apartment? She said, we will continue the investigation. She said, was she in contact with anyone here in Ghent that you know of? I said, I do not know. I said, I have not spoken to her in approximately a year. I drove home through the wet streets. It was after 1 o'clock. The coffee in the kitchen was still cold. I poured it down the drain and made fresh coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked at the technical manual about bridge reinforcement methods, and I did not read it. I thought about Emma. I thought about the 7 years she had been part of Thomas's life, and therefore part of mine. I thought about the Christmas dinners and the conversations on the phone about social work and structural engineering, two disciplines that have more in common than most people would expect, both concerned with the question of what holds things up and what happens when the holding fails. I thought about the call 2 years ago when she had thanked me for always answering. I thought about the face on the table in the hospital room. At 2 in the morning, I called Thomas. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice had the quality of someone who had been asleep and who was not pleased about being woken, but who was managing this displeasure for my sake. I said, Thomas, I need to tell you something. He said, Papa, it is 2 in the morning. I said, I know. I said, the police called me tonight. He said, what police? I said, Emma is dead. The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds. Then he said, what? I said, Emma Dirks. She was found in an apartment in Ghent. The police called me because I was listed as her emergency contact. He said nothing for another few seconds. I said, Thomas. He said, I heard you. He said, I am sorry. He said it in the specific tone of someone managing a shock, organizing the response to a shock, rather than being inside it, which I noted without analyzing at that moment, because at that moment I was not in the mode of analysis. He said, how did she die? I said, they do not know yet. The toxicology will take time. He said, when did this happen? I said, she was found yesterday morning. The neighbour reported not seeing her for 3 days. He said, she was in Ghent. I said, she was living in the Vlaamse. I said, did you know she was back? He said, no. He said, I had not been in contact with Emma for a long time. I said, I know. He said, Papa, I am sorry you had to go through this. I said, thank you. He said, are you all right? I said, I am all right. He said, call me in the morning. I said, yes. I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The rain had resumed outside. The technical manual was in front of me. I am a structural engineer, and I have spent 40 years thinking about the relationship between what we can see and what we cannot see, about the forces that act on structures and that are not visible from the outside, about the gap between the appearance of soundness and the actual condition of the supporting elements. I sat at the kitchen table in the rain, and I thought about the gap between what Thomas had said and the quality of the voice that had said it. The words were right. The voice was off in a way that I could not specify precisely, and that I had no reason in that moment to pursue. A man had been woken at 2 in the morning to be told that his girlfriend of 7 years, his ex-girlfriend, was dead. The voice of a man in that situation is not necessarily the voice of his ordinary life. I went to bed at 3. I did not sleep well. In the morning, I called Inspector Devos at 9 o'clock. She answered and said she was glad I had called. She said, Mr. Van der Meersch, I have some questions. I would like to ask you if you are willing. I said, of course. She said, when did you last see Emma Dirks? I said, approximately a year ago. She came through Ghent on her way from Amsterdam. She stopped to bring me a book. I said, before that, I had spoken to her on the phone approximately 8 months ago. She said, what was the nature of your relationship with her? I said, she was my son's girlfriend for 7 years. After they separated, she continued to call occasionally. I said she had no family here in Ghent. I said, I believe she found it useful to have someone she could call. The inspector said, did she seem troubled in your last conversation? I thought about this. I said, she seemed calm, more calm than I had sometimes heard her. She said, was that unusual? I said it was. She said, in what direction had she been troubled before? I said, the separation from Thomas was difficult for her. The work she did was difficult in a different way. She was very committed to her clients. She carried it. She said, did she ever speak to you about threats or concerns for her safety? I said no. She said about her health. I said no. She said, did she drink or use substances to your knowledge? I said, not when I knew her. She was not someone who avoided difficult feelings with substances. She moved toward difficult things rather than away from them. The inspector was quiet for a moment. She said, Mr. Vandermeersch, I would like to meet with you in person this week if possible. I said, of course. When and where? She came to my apartment on Friday. She brought a younger colleague, a man named Inspector Jan Verhulst, who was perhaps 32 and who had the specific quality of someone who is very good at their job and who has not yet lost the alertness that experience sometimes smooths away. They sat at my kitchen table where I had sat at 2 in the morning on Wednesday, and I made coffee for 3 and we talked for 90 minutes. She told me carefully and in the specific language of someone who is sharing what they can share while protecting what they must protect the following. Emma had been living in the Vlaamse apartment for approximately 4 months. She had moved back from Amsterdam in October. The inspector did not know yet why she had moved back. The apartment was rented in her name. The rental had been paid in cash 4 months ago and 1 month at a time since. There was evidence in the apartment that she had been working. Specifically, there was a laptop and files that related to what appeared to be professional research, but the inspector was not sharing the content of the files. The medication found in the apartment was a sedative prescribed. The prescription was from a physician in Amsterdam written 14 months ago. The pills in the bottle were the original pills not refilled. Inspector Verhulst said at one point, did Emma have enemies to your knowledge? I said I would not know specifically. The work she did created situations where powerful people were uncomfortable with what she was doing. She worked with vulnerable people, and sometimes the vulnerability of those people was connected to the interests of people who did not want the connection made visible. The inspector said, can you be more specific? I said no. I said, because I am speculating. I said, what I am telling you is that the work she did was not work that was invisible to powerful people. She nodded. At the end of the 90 minutes, the inspector said, I want to ask you something directly. I said, please do. She said, do you believe Emma Dirks died of natural causes? I held this for a moment. I said, I believe Emma Dirks was a physically healthy woman of 34 who had no history of substance use and who was described by everyone who knew her as a person who moved toward difficulty rather than away from it. I said she was not the kind of person who retreats from life. I said I do not believe she died of natural causes. I said, but I am a structural engineer, not a detective. And I am telling you what I know about the person, not about the circumstances. The inspector nodded. She said, thank you. They left. I stood at the window and watched their car pull away into the Ghent afternoon. The Scheldt was silver in the February light. I thought about what I had said to the inspector. I had told her the truth. I had also told her something I had not known I believed until I said it aloud, which is the specific mechanism by which certain truths become available, when the act of giving them language reveals them as having been present before they were spoken. I called Frank Dirks in Kortrijk, his daughter's real father. I found his number through a combination of memory and search, because Emma had told me his name and the town and the occupation, and the specific combination of those 3 things was sufficient to find him in a country the size of Belgium. He answered on the 2nd ring. He had a voice like poured concrete, low and rough and specific. I told him who I was and that I had known his daughter. He said, I know who you are. She talked about you. I said, I am sorry about Emma. He said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the police told me cardiac arrest. I said, I know. He said, she was 34 years old. He said it in the voice of a man who is providing a fact that is too large to be received as merely a fact. I said yes. He said Mr. Vandermeersch. I said Peter. He said Peter. He said Emma did not have heart problems. She went to the doctor every year. She was healthy. I said, I know. He said, someone needs to explain to me how a healthy 34-year-old woman dies of cardiac arrest alone in an apartment in Ghent. I said, I agree. He said, I am going to come to Ghent. I said, yes. He said, will you help me? I said, I will help you. He came the following Tuesday. He was 62 years old, and he was shorter than I had imagined, compact and solid, in the way of men who have spent their lives in physical work, a man who drove a delivery route, and who had the forearms of someone who has been loading and unloading for 40 years. He sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee I made, and he said almost nothing for the first 10 minutes, which I understood as the specific behavior of someone who is processing something enormous and who requires time before words are useful. Then he said, she called me in October, when she moved back to Ghent. I said I did not know she had moved back until the inspector told me. He said she did not tell many people. He said she told me she was working on something and that she needed to be in Ghent for it and that she was being careful. I said careful. He said that is the word she used. I said, did she say careful about what? He said no. He said she would explain when it was done. He said she would be careful and she would be safe and she would call me when it was done. He said I waited for her to call. He said she did not call. He looked at the table. He said, I have her phone. The police gave it to me. Not the phone in the apartment. She had another phone. A second phone prepaid. He said, I did not know she had it. He said it was in a box in her closet that the police found. He said they copied the contents and gave me the original. He said, I have been looking at the messages. I said, what did you find? He said, I found messages to a person she identifies in her contacts only as L. The messages go back 6 months. He said, the early messages are about a meeting, about information she has found about wanting to share it with this person. He said, the later messages are different. He said the later messages suggest this person told her to stop, told her to be careful, told her it was too dangerous. He said, the last message from Emma to this person was 11 days before she was found. It says, I know what they did. I have the evidence. I am going to the police next week. I looked at Frank Dierickx across my kitchen table in Ghent in February. I said, do you know who L is? He said, no. He said, the number is prepaid. The police are trying to trace it, but it is difficult. He said, I thought you might know. He said, you knew her people. I thought about who Emma's people were. She had been Thomas's girlfriend. She had friends from the university, from the social work world, from the organizations she had worked for. She had colleagues in Amsterdam. She had former clients who had become something more than clients, in the way that happens in work that is close and intense and human. I went through these categories in my mind, looking for someone who might be called L. I said, can I see the messages? He said yes. He showed me the phone. The messages with L were what he had described. I read through them carefully. The early messages were warm and direct, the messages of two people who trusted each other and who were discussing something that mattered. L's responses were measured, sometimes concerned, sometimes encouraging. As the messages progressed, L became more cautious. One message from L said, Emma, I am telling you this because I care about you. What you are describing is not something to take on alone. Another said, please talk to someone who can protect you. The message 11 days before she was found that Frank had described was there, I know what they did. I have the evidence. I am going to the police next week. There was no response from L, or rather there was a response 3 days after Emma's message that said only, where are you? There was no reply from Emma after that. I looked at the messages for a long time. I said, Frank, the police have the contents of this phone. He said, yes. I said, and they are tracing the L number. He said, they say it is taking time. He said, the phone the messages came from was activated in Amsterdam 18 months ago and used only for these messages. He said, "It is effectively untraceable in any rapid way," he said. "The police are not treating this as a priority because the official position is still that Emma died of cardiac arrest," he said. "The toxicology has not come back yet," he said. "They are not actively investigating a crime." I said, "What was Emma working on?" He said, "I do not know the specifics." He said she worked with unaccompanied minors, young people who had come to the Netherlands alone without family and who were vulnerable in the specific ways that such vulnerability expresses itself through people who exploit vulnerability rather than addressing it. He said, in Amsterdam she had been involved in a significant case involving the exploitation of young migrants. He said the case had been referred to authorities and had resulted in some prosecutions. He said, but Emma believed the prosecutions had not reached the people at the top. He said she believed there were people in Ghent who were connected to the network that had been prosecuted in Amsterdam. He said she moved back to Ghent to find them. I sat with this for a while. Then I said, who was her contact in Ghent? Who was helping her here? He said, I do not know. He said, I believe L is someone in Ghent. He said, the messages suggest someone who knew the specific situation and who was warning her about specific dangers. He said, someone who knew who she was dealing with. I said, I need to think about this. He said, yes. He said, Peter. I said, yes. He said, my daughter moved back to this city to do something important and dangerous, and she did it carefully, and she told me she would be safe, and she died anyway. He said, I need to know what happened. He said, I am not a man who can do this kind of investigation. I am a man who drives a delivery route. I said, I know. He said, but I believe you are a man who looks at something broken and finds out what made it break. I said, yes. He said, I need you to find out what made this break. I called Inspector Devos the following morning. She answered on the first ring. I told her about the second phone and the L messages. She said, we know about the second phone. She said, we are working on the trace. I said, Inspector, I need to tell you something. She said, yes. I said, I believe Emma Dirks was investigating a network of people in Ghent who were connected to exploitation of vulnerable migrants. I said I believe she had found evidence. I said I believe someone stopped her before she could bring that evidence to the police. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Mr. Vandermeersch, what you are describing would constitute murder. I said, yes, she said. The investigation is ongoing. I said, Inspector, are you treating this as potentially a murder? She said, we are treating it as a suspicious death pending the toxicology results. She said, when we have the toxicology, the position will be clearer. I said, and if the toxicology shows something consistent with natural causes, she said, then we will need other evidence to justify continuing as a murder investigation. She said, the L messages are significant. She said, we are working on it. I thanked her and ended the call. I spent the following days doing what I do when I am dealing with a problem that requires a different kind of thinking than the problem usually receives. I walked. I walked the city, specifically the parts of the city that Emma had inhabited in her final months, the Vlaamse district and the streets around it, the cafes where people from that neighborhood drank coffee in the mornings, the park beside the water where people walked at lunchtime. I was looking for something and I did not know what I was looking for, which is the specific state of attention that sometimes produces the thing you could not have found if you had known what to look for. On the fourth day of walking, I found it. It was not what I had expected. It was not a person or a place or a document. It was a name. I was walking along the Vlaamse on a Thursday morning and I passed a community centre that had a notice board at its entrance. One of those boards with printed sheets protected by a plastic cover, announcements and events and a list of the organisation's services. The organisation was called the Vlaams Steunpunt voor Vluchtelingen, the Flemish Support Centre for Refugees. Among the services listed was a legal advice service for unaccompanied minors. Among the staff listed on the notice was a coordinator named Lien Verbeeke. Lion L. I stood in front of the notice board for a long time. Then I went inside. Lian Verbeke was 40 years old, a thin woman with the specific physical quality of someone who has been under sustained stress for an extended period, the quality of someone who is maintaining function at a considerable cost to the reserves that maintain function. She looked at me when I asked for her, and her face had the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for something and is not certain whether what has arrived is the thing they were waiting for or something else. I said, "My name is Peter Vandermeersch." I said, "I am Emma's Peter." She closed her eyes for approximately 3 seconds. Then she said, "Come with me." We sat in her office with the door closed. She said, "I knew you would come eventually." I said, "You are Elle." She said, "Yes." She said, "I have been expecting the police." I said, "They are tracing the number from the second phone." She said, "I know." She said, "I have been speaking to a lawyer about what to tell them." She said, "I was afraid." She said it simply without self-justification. I was afraid, and I did not know what to do. I said, "Tell me what you know." What she knew was this: she had met Emma in Amsterdam at a conference on migrant protection 4 years earlier. They had stayed in contact. When Emma came back to Ghent, she had called Lian because Lian had been working in Ghent for 8 years and knew the landscape of organizations and institutions and the specific people involved in the care and exploitation of vulnerable migrants in the city. Emma had shared with Lian what she had found in Amsterdam and what she believed was connected to Ghent. Lian had helped her initially by providing context and contacts, and then by identifying specific patterns in the funding and governance of organizations in Ghent that matched what Emma had described from Amsterdam. What they had found together over 6 months was this: there was a network. The network was not a formal organization, but a set of relationships between specific individuals in positions that gave them access to vulnerable young people, access to funding that was not properly supervised, and access to each other through shared board memberships and professional connections. The network was not large. It required only a small number of people at key points in the system, people who could direct resources, people who could deflect attention, people who could ensure that complaints were not heard or investigations were not pursued. The network had names. Lian and Emma had documented the names over 6 months of careful work. They had documentary evidence, financial records, testimonies from young people who had been through the system and who were now old enough and safe enough to speak. Emma had told Lian she was going to the police. Lian had begged her to wait, to find someone they could trust within the police who was not connected to the network. Emma had said she knew the right person. She had said she would go to that person the following week. She did not go. Lian said, 3 days after she sent me that message, she was dead. She said I should have protected her. I should have been more careful. She said I did not warn her specifically enough. I said, Lian. She looked at me. I said, what did you do after she died? She said I was frightened. I said, I understand. I said, what did you do with the evidence? She said, it is here. She put her hand on a laptop on her desk. She said, Emma sent me copies of everything. She said, I have the complete documentation. I said, you have to go to the police. She said, I know. She said, I was afraid they were involved. I said, Inspector DeVos is not involved. She said, how do you know? I said, I do not know with certainty. I said, but I have spoken to her twice, and she is pushing the investigation toward exactly the conclusion that the network would not want reached. I said, if she were connected to the network, she would not be doing that. Lian looked at me for a long moment. She said, you are a man who spends his life looking at bridges. I said, yes. She said, you look at a bridge and you decide whether it is safe. I said, yes. She said, you are looking at me and at this inspector and you are making the same calculation. I said, yes. She said, are you confident in your assessment? I said, I am sufficiently confident to recommend the action. She said, that is not the same as certainty. I said, no. In bridge engineering, certainty is not achievable. What is achievable is the best assessment available and a decision based on that assessment. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She said, "How do we do this?" We did it together. Lean and I sat with Inspector DeVos that afternoon. We brought the laptop, we brought the documentation. We sat in a room at the Ghent police headquarters, and Lien Verbeke, a 40-year-old social worker who had been frightened for 3 weeks, told the inspector everything. Inspector DeVos listened for 2 hours. Inspector Verhulst took notes. At the end of the 2 hours, the inspector said, "This is significant material." She said it in the tone of someone who has been working towards something and who has now received the confirmation that the direction was correct. She said, "We will need to verify everything." She said, "The toxicology will be back in 4 days." She said, "I need both of you to stay available." She looked at me. She said, "Mr. Vandermeersch, I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is there anyone in your personal life who may be connected to what we are investigating?" I looked at her. I held this for a moment. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Is there anyone close to you who may have had contact with Emma in the months before her death that you were not aware of?" I said, "Specifically." She said, "Specifically, I want to know about contact between Emma and your son, Thomas." The silence in the room was complete. I said, "I do not know the answer to that question." I said, "Thomas told me he had not been in contact with Emma for a long time." She said, "Yes." She said, "I want to ask you whether you believe him." I said, "Inspector, I am a man whose professional training requires him to answer that question carefully." I said, "A bridge is either safe or it is not. The question of whether it is safe requires examination of the specific structure, not the assertion of the engineer who built it." I said, "I cannot answer your question from assertion." I said, "I need to look at the structure." I went home. I sat in my kitchen. I looked at the technical manual about bridge reinforcement methods. I did not read it. I thought about what the inspector had said. I thought about the fact that Emma had moved back to Ghent 4 months ago and had not told me. I thought about the fact that she had not called me in a year, which was unusual for Emma. I thought about the quality of Thomas's voice at 2 a.m. when I had told him Emma was dead. The voice of a man managing a shock rather than being inside it. I called Thomas at 7 o'clock that evening. He answered on the first ring, which was itself unusual. He said, "Papa." I said, "Thomas, I need to ask you something directly." He said, "Yes." I said, "When did you last speak to Emma?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "A few months ago." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "Papa, what is this about?" I said, "Thomas, I need you to answer my question." He said, "She called me. She wanted to meet. She said she was working on something and she needed to talk to me." I said, "And did you meet her?" He said, "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "I told her it was not a good time. I told her I was busy." I said, "Thomas." He said, "Yes." I said, "What was she working on?" He said, "She said something about an investigation. She said she had found something. She said she needed to talk to me because she needed someone who understood finance." He said, "I told her to talk to someone at her organization." He said, "I told her I could not be involved." He said, "Papa, I have a wife. I have a career." He said, "Whatever Emma was doing, I could not be involved in it." I said, "Did you tell anyone about this conversation?" He said, "No." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Thomas, it means I need to know if you told anyone that Emma was working on an investigation in Ghent." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "No." He said, "I told Ingrid that Emma had called. I told her Emma was working on something." He said, "Ingrid said it was typical Emma." He said, "Ingrid never liked Emma." He said, "She said Emma was always in trouble." He said, and I left it at that. I said, "Did you tell Ingrid what the investigation was about?" He said, "No." I said, "Did Ingrid know Emma was in Ghent?" He said, "Aye." He stopped. He said, "She may have." I said, "Did you tell her?" He said, "I may have mentioned it." He said, "Papa, why does this matter?" I said, "Thomas, Ingrid's family is in shipping in Antwerp." He said, "Yes." I said, "What do you know about the specific nature of their shipping business?" He said, "It is a large operation. Freight logistics international contracts." He said, "Papa, where is this going?" I said, Thomas in the shipping business, international freight, who are the clients? He said, all kinds of companies, I said, including companies that operate in countries where the regulation of migration and labor is. He stopped speaking. There was a long silence. He said, Papa. I said, I need you to think very carefully about what you know about Ingrid's family business, and I need you to tell me whether there is any possibility that they have interests connected to what Emma was investigating. He did not answer immediately. I waited. I have learned over 40 years of structural engineering that the most important information is sometimes in the pause before the answer rather than in the answer itself. The pause tells you the shape of what is coming. He said, I do not know. He said, I have never been involved in the business. He said, I handle family finances. He said, I do not know the operational side. He said, Papa, are you suggesting that Ingrid's family is involved in something criminal? I said, I am asking you to tell me what you know. He said, I need to think. He said, I need to look at some things. He said, give me until tomorrow morning. I said, Thomas, if you know something, you need to tell the police. Not me. The police. He said, I understand. He said, tomorrow morning. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the technical manual unread in front of me, and I thought about the structure of what I was looking at. In structural engineering, when you discover that a load-bearing element is compromised, the question is not how to conceal the compromise, but how to address it. The address may be painful. The building may need to be closed. People may lose access to something they depend on. But the alternative to addressing it is that the structure fails in a way that cannot be controlled. At 8 in the morning, Thomas called me. His voice had changed. It had the quality that voices have when someone has spent the night looking at something they had been not looking at and has arrived at the end of that process. He said, Papa. I said, yes. He said, I looked at some records. He said, I have access to certain financial accounts that Ingrid asked me to manage 2 years ago. He said, I did not look closely at them at the time because I trusted her. He said, I looked at them last night. He said, there are transfers, regular transfers to organizations in Belgium and the Netherlands. He said, the organizations are small. They appear charitable on the surface. He said, but some of them, he stopped. He said, some of them are the same organizations that Emma documented. He said, Papa, Ingrid knew. He said, Ingrid's family is connected to this. I said, you need to call Inspector Devos now. He said, yes. He said, Papa. I said, yes. He said, I did not know. I said, I know. He said, I told Ingrid Emma was in Ghent working on an investigation. I said, I know. He said, she may have told her family. He said, she may have told her father. He said, if that is what happened. He stopped. He said, if that is what happened, then He stopped again. I said, Thomas. He said, yes. I said, call the inspector. Call her now. And then you come to Ghent. He came. The investigation proceeded from there with the specific momentum that investigations gain when the evidence is sufficient and the right people are doing the work. I will not detail every step because the steps belong to the investigators and to the legal process and to the young people whose testimony formed the core of the case and whose courage in speaking was the foundation on which everything else was built. What I will tell you is the relevant shape of what the investigation found. The network was real. The network was small but connected, and the connections ran through Ghent and Amsterdam and Antwerp and through several international freight operations that used their logistics infrastructure to move not only goods but people, specifically the young people who arrived in Europe without family and without protection and who were directed. Through a series of referrals and housing placements that appeared normal on the surface toward situations that were not normal. The financial flows that Thomas had found in the accounts were the same financial flows that Emma had documented. The organizations that appeared charitable were the same organizations. The people at the center of the network in Ghent were 3 individuals. 2 of whom were on the board of an organization that received public funding for refugee support. Ingrid Meis's father, Hendrik Meis, was one of the 3. He was the Antwerp connection. He was the person who provided the logistics infrastructure and the international financial routing. He had not personally directed what happened to Emma, but he had been told that a woman was investigating the network and was about to go to the police. And he had passed this information to the two individuals in Ghent who ran the operational side. What those individuals had done with the information was what the toxicology confirmed, which arrived on the fourth day after Lien and I met with Inspector Devos, and which showed that Emma Dirks had died not from cardiac arrest in the ordinary sense, but from a combination of substances administered in quantities consistent with deliberate poisoning rather than voluntary consumption. She had been murdered in the apartment on the Vlaamse Kaai, with the door locked from the inside with no signs of forced entry, with a medication bottle on the counter in a way designed to look like exactly what it looked like until you looked at the specific details that Emma herself had taught me to look at by the specific character of who she was. The details that are not visible from the surface. The forces acting on the structure that you do not see unless you are looking for them with the right instruments. The arrests were made over a period of 3 weeks. Hendrik Meijs was arrested in Antwerp. The two individuals in Ghent were arrested at their homes. International warrants were issued for contacts in the Netherlands. The young people whose testimony had formed the core of Emma's documented evidence gave their testimony to investigators, and some of them gave their testimony in court. The trial lasted 4 months. I attended some of it. Frank Dirks attended all of it. He sat in the front row on the public side and he listened to everything, and he looked at the people who had killed his daughter with the expression of a man who is registering information that he will carry for the rest of his life. Thomas, I need to tell you about Thomas. He was not charged. The investigation found no evidence that he had knowledge of the criminal activity before Emma's death. He had known she was in Ghent. He had told Ingrid. He had not known the consequences. He was questioned extensively. His testimony was consistent. The investigators concluded that he had acted with negligence but not complicity. He left Ingrid before the trial. He left the apartment in Brussels and rented a small apartment in Ghent, and he took a leave of absence from the bank. I do not know what he did in those months entirely. I know that he came to my apartment on Sundays, and that we ate together, and that we talked about things that were not the events that had brought him back to Ghent, and gradually over the Sundays. We began to talk about the events themselves, not all at once, not easily. The way you repair a damaged structure which is incrementally and with constant assessment of whether the repair is holding before you proceed to the next section. He said one Sunday in November, about 9 months after Emma was found, I think about her every day. He said, I think about the conversation. He said, she needed someone who understood finance, and I told her to find someone at her organization. He said, if I had met her. He said, if I had listened. I said, Thomas. He said, yes. I said, you cannot know what would have happened. He said, no. He said, but I know what did happen. I said, yes. I said, that is something you will carry. He said, I know. He said, Papa. I said, yes. He said, I am going to carry it properly. I said, yes. I said, I think you are. He went back to Brussels in January. He is working at a smaller firm now, one that does financial consulting for non-profit organizations. I do not know entirely why he made this choice. I think I understand some of it. I visited Frank Dirks in Kortrijk in April. We sat in his kitchen, which was smaller than mine and more cluttered than the kitchen of a man who lives alone and who has the specific relationship with domestic space of someone for whom the space is functional rather than inhabited. He made coffee. He did not talk for a long time. Then he said, Emma would have liked you more than she admitted. I said, she admitted quite a lot. He said, yes. He said, she told me you were the kind of man who actually listened. I said, she was the kind of person who said things worth listening to. He said, yes. He looked at his cup. He said, I am thinking about what she was building. The case, the documentation. He said, it is being used. The prosecutors used it. The young people whose testimony she collected were heard because of what she did. He said, it did not save her. He said, "But it mattered." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is something." I said, "Yes." I said, "That is significant." I am writing this in my apartment in Ghent on a Tuesday evening in October. The Scheldt is dark outside the window. The technical manual about bridge reinforcement methods is on the desk. I have been working on it. There is a bridge in the Kempen region, a steel arch bridge built in 1937 that requires a specific assessment of the fatigue in its primary tension members. And the assessment requires the kind of careful attention to things that are not visible from the outside that I have been practicing for 40 years, and that I find I am practicing now with a quality of attention that is slightly different from before, slightly more aware of what the attention is for and why it matters. Emma Dierickx was 34 years old, and she was a social worker, and she moved toward difficult things rather than away from them, and she documented evidence that put powerful people in prison, and she did not survive the doing of it. Her work survived her. The young people whose lives she worked to protect were protected, not as many as she would have wanted, and not completely. But some of them, and because of what she documented, and the courage of their testimony, and the work of Inspector DeVos and her team, there is a better chance for the next ones. I answered the phone at 11:20 on a Wednesday night in February, because I always answer the phone regardless of the hour. I answered it because I had been trained by 40 years of structural work to understand that unusual hours are when things go wrong, and that things going wrong is not something you let go to voicemail. I answered it, and a police inspector told me a woman was dead, and asked if she was my daughter, and I said she was not my daughter, and then I went to the hospital, and I looked at her face, and I said yes in every way that matters, yes. In every way that matters. She was my daughter in every way that matters. I carried her in the way a father carries a child, not on my shoulders but in my attention, in the answered calls and the cups of coffee and the conversations about things that mattered. I carry her still. You do not stop carrying the people who chose you as someone worth calling. You carry them forward. That is what they asked when they put your name in the phone. That is what I am doing. I want to describe more fully what happened in the period between my first meeting with Inspector DeVos and the meeting with Leon Verbeke, because the full description contains things that are important to understanding how the investigation actually proceeded. Things that are not dramatic in the way that investigations are sometimes described as dramatic, but that were the actual substance of the work. After Frank Dierickx came to Ghent and showed me the phone with the L messages, I spent 3 days on my own before the meeting with Leanne. 3 days of the kind of thinking that structural work requires when the situation is complex and the available information is incomplete. In structural assessment, when you are dealing with a structure whose current condition is unclear, you begin not with hypothesis but with inventory. You establish what you know with certainty, what you know with reasonable probability, and what you do not know. You do not fill the gaps in the inventory with assumption. You identify the gaps and you look for the specific information that would close them. What I knew with certainty, Emma was dead. She had been living in Ghent for 4 months. She had been working on an investigation. She had a second phone through which she had communicated with someone called L. The messages with L showed that she had found evidence and had intended to go to the police. She had died before going to the police. What I knew, with reasonable probability, the death was not natural. The inspector's questions and the specific phrasing of her investigation suggested this even before the toxicology confirmed it. Emma had been murdered. The murder was connected to the investigation. What I did not know who L was. What specifically the investigation had found, whether there were others who knew what Emma knew, whether the evidence she had described to L still existed somewhere. The inventory was clear. The critical gap was L. If L could be found, the other gaps would close. I had the phone. I had the messages. I had the specific institutional landscape of refugee support organizations in Ghent, which I knew in general terms from years of living in this city and from the conversations Emma and I had had over the years about her work. I sat down for a full day and I constructed a list of every organisation in Ghent that worked with migrants and refugees and that had staff in appropriate positions to be the person Emma had described to Frank as a contact in Ghent. The list had 17 entries. I eliminated the ones whose profile did not match the specific language of Elle's messages. I was left with 6. Of the 6, 3 had contact information that I found through public records. I called each of them and asked carefully whether they had known Emma Diericks. 2 said no in a way that I believed. 1 said she had known Emma from a conference and seemed genuinely surprised to hear that Emma had died, and the quality of the surprise was the quality of someone for whom the news was new. This person was not Elle. Of the remaining 3, 1 was the Vlaams Steunpunt voor Vluchtelingen on the Vlaamse Kaai. I had noted it in my walks, but had not yet investigated its staff directly. On the 4th day, I went to look at the notice board and found the name Lien Verbeke, and the confirmation was immediate and specific. The confirmation of someone who has been looking at a structure and has suddenly seen the load path that explains the behavior they have been observing. I want to describe the moment of the confirmation more carefully because it is a moment that has stayed with me. I was standing in front of the notice board and I read the name and I understood all at once the connection. And for a moment, standing in the cold February air on the Vlaamse Kaai with the Scheldt barely visible at the end of the street, I felt what I have felt at similar moments in structural assessment, which is not triumph and not satisfaction, but a specific quality of grief. The grief of understanding something that has been caused by what you have now understood. A bridge fails because of a specific combination of factors, and when you understand the combination, the understanding does not remove the failure. It only makes it possible to address the cause rather than the symptom. Emma had been killed because someone understood what she knew. If I could find who Elle was and what Emma knew, the cause could be addressed. The cause being addressed would not bring Emma back. It would protect the people she had been trying to protect. It would honour, in the only way available to the living, what the dead had been trying to do. I went inside. I want to describe more fully the conversation with Thomas the night after I met with Lien, because that conversation was the most difficult conversation of this period, and the one that I think about most often. When I called Thomas at 7 o'clock that evening and we went through the exchange, I have described the exchange in which he told me Emma had called him and he had told her to find someone else and then told Ingrid that Emma was working on an investigation in Ghent. I was operating in the specific state of attention that structural assessment requires when the structure you are examining has already partially failed and when the failure has had consequences. The state is not dispassionate exactly. It is more accurate to say it is the state in which passion is not the instrument that will address the problem. And you therefore set the passion aside, not because you do not feel it, but because feeling it will not help. Thomas was my son. He was 38 years old, and he had been in a marriage for 3 years with a woman whose family turned out to be involved in the exploitation and murder of vulnerable people and a woman whose former girlfriend. He had not known these things in their full dimensions. He had known part of the picture, in the way that people often know part of the picture, and had chosen not to look at the rest of it in the way that people often choose not to look when looking would be uncomfortable, and when not looking seems to carry no cost. The cost in this case was Emma. I did not say this to him on the phone that night. I did not say it at any point in the conversations that followed. It was a conclusion that I held privately and that I believed he was holding privately as well from the specific quality of what he said and did not say in the months after the investigation concluded. The truth of the matter was not something that needed to be stated between us because it was already present between us in the specific way of things that are fully understood without being said aloud. What I want to describe is the moment on the phone when he went quiet after I had asked whether he had told Ingrid what the investigation was about. The quiet lasted approximately 6 seconds. In structural engineering, a pause in the behavior of a structure, a place where the expected response does not come, is often the most significant data point in an assessment. The pause tells you that something is happening that the surface is not showing. I heard Thomas's pause, and I understood what it meant, not precisely, but in the way that experience enables understanding before the specific content of the understanding is available. I understood that Thomas was in that pause, arriving at a comprehension he had been avoiding. He arrived at it. He said he needed to look at some things. He said he would call in the morning. He called at 8 in the morning and he told me what he had found. He told me carefully and with the precision of someone who had spent the night with information they had found and had decided there was no version of what to do with it that did not require telling the truth. He told me about the transfers and the organizations. He told me about what the connection implied. He said, "Papa." I told Ingrid that Emma was in Ghent, working on an investigation. He said it, and he waited. He was waiting for me to say something that would tell him what to do with it. I understood this. I said, "Thomas, call the inspector now, and then you come to Ghent." He came, he called first, and then he came and he sat in my kitchen and he drank the coffee I made and he told the inspector everything he had told me and then more, because Inspector DeVos is very good at her work and the things she does not know how to ask for, she is very good at creating the conditions for the witness to offer. He was with the inspector for 4 hours. He came back to my apartment afterward and sat at the table, and I made more coffee, and neither of us said anything for a long time. He said, "I keep thinking about the last time I saw her." I said, "When was that?" He said it was a year before the separation. We were at a work dinner of mine, and she came and she sat across from me at the table, and she listened to the people around us talk about financial markets and real estate investment. And she was very polite and very quiet and very present, the way she was always present. And at the end of the dinner, when we were in the car going home, she said, "Thomas, do you ever think about the people at the other end of the money?" I said, "What?" She said, "The money in the markets you work with. It goes somewhere. It comes from somewhere. Do you think about the people at the other end?" He said I told her she was being idealistic. I told her that markets were systems, and systems operated on their own logic, and the individual conscience of the people inside them was not the relevant instrument. He said, she looked out the window and she said, "Then what is the relevant instrument?" He looked at his coffee cup. He said, she was right. He said she was right, and I told her she was being idealistic, and a year later I left her. He said I built a life with a person I thought was more practical. He said, more realistic. He said, more like me. He said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." He said I was an idiot. I said, "Yes." He said, "Is that all you are going to say?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he almost laughed, which is the sound of someone who has arrived at a truth and who finds the truth both devastating and clarifying. He said, "Fair enough." I said, "Thomas." He said, "Yes." I said, "You are not an idiot in the ongoing sense. You are a person who made choices and who is now in the position of accounting for those choices." He said, "That is not much better." I said, "No." I said, "But it is the accurate version." He said, "What do I do now?" I said, "You call the inspector in the morning and you tell her everything you have not yet told her because there is more." He said, "Yes." He said, "There is more." I said, "I know." I said, "Tell her everything." He said, "And then?" I said, "And then you figure out who you are from here." He nodded. He left at midnight. He drove back to Brussels to get the additional documents, and he came back to Ghent the next morning, and he spent 3 more hours with Inspector DeVos. By the end of that second session, the case against Hendrik Meijs and his associates was essentially complete in its financial documentation, which was the hardest part of the case to build, and which Thomas had, inadvertently, and through the specific pain of his own reckoning provided. There are 3 more things I want to tell you about in the right order, because the right order matters for the full account. The first is the toxicology report. It came back 11 days after I met with Lien Verbeke and 4 days after Lien and I had met with Inspector DeVos. The report confirmed what I had suspected and what Inspector Devos had been working toward. Emma had been administered a combination of a sedative and a substance that in sufficient quantities produced cardiac depression. The specific cardiac failure that appeared on the initial examination to be the natural death of a young woman who had perhaps mixed medications. The concentrations were not consistent with voluntary consumption. The specific combination was one that required knowledge of pharmacology and access to substances not available over the counter. The toxicologist's report characterized the death as a homicide. The inspector called me when the report came back. She said, "Mr. van der Meersch." I said, "Inspector." She said, "The toxicology confirms what we suspected." She said, "We are now formally treating this as a murder investigation." I said, "Yes." She said, "The material you and Lien Verbeke provided has been central to identifying the suspects." She said, "I want to thank you." I said, "Emma did the work." I said, "Lien and I provided the context." She said, "Yes." She said, "That is an accurate description." She said, "Mr. van der Meersch, I want to ask you one more question." I said, "Yes." She said, "When you looked at Emma's face in the hospital on the night you came to identify her, did you believe then that she had been murdered?" I said I did not have the word for it that night. She said, "But you believed something was wrong." I said, "Yes." I said, "The structure did not match the surface." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The structure did not match the surface." I said, "The way she was described by her own life and by the people who knew her was not consistent with the death she was supposed to have died." She said, "Yes." She said, "That is well put." She said, "Mr. van der Meersch, there is work ahead. Testimony proceedings, things that will be difficult." I said, "I know." I said, "I will be here." The second thing is Lien Verbeke. After the investigation concluded and the arrests had been made, Lien and I met for coffee at a cafe on the Graslie, which is the specific medieval street on the waterfront in Ghent that has been there for 800 years, and that has the quality of those streets, the quality of something that has outlasted many of the things that seemed permanent in its time. We sat outside in October with our coffee in the cold air, and we talked for 2 hours. She had been placed on a leave of absence from the Steenpunt during the investigation, which was a practical measure and not a reflection of her conduct. She was expected to return when the proceedings concluded. She told me she was thinking about whether to return. She said I did the work with Emma because I believed in it. She said I also did not warn her strongly enough. She said, "I knew she was in danger and I told her to be careful and I did not do enough to protect her." I said, "Lien." She said, "Yes." I said, "You were also afraid." I said, "Fear is not a moral failure, it is a condition." She said, "It is a condition that cost Emma her life." I said, "Yes." I said, "It is also the condition that brought you to the police with the evidence that put the people responsible in prison." She said, "Not soon enough." I said, "No." I said, "Not soon enough, but you did come." I said, "People who do not come at all do not suffer what you are suffering." She was quiet. She said, "That is a very precise way to say a generous thing." I said, "It is an accurate way to say an accurate thing." She said, "Yes." She returned to the Steenpunt in the spring. She wrote to me to tell me. I wrote back to say I was glad. The third thing is a walk I took. In June, 4 months after the arrests, on a warm afternoon with the light, the specific gold of Ghent in early summer, I walked the route that Emma would have walked from the Vlaamsekai apartment to the Steenpunt on the Korenlai, which is the route she would have taken on the days she met Lien. It is not a long walk. It takes approximately 12 minutes at a moderate pace. You cross 2 bridges, one over a smaller canal and one over the Laaie. And from the second bridge on a clear day, you can see the towers of the St. Baf's Cathedral and the Gravenstein Castle and the old guild houses on the Gralai and the whole specific skyline of this city that has been building itself for 1,000 years. I stood on the second bridge for a while. The water below was green in the summer light. A tourist boat was moving slowly through the canal with a guide speaking into a microphone about the history of the bridges. The people on the boat were looking at the guild houses and taking photographs. The bridge I was standing on was a steel bridge from 1924, one I had assessed for the City Council 10 years ago. A bridge with specific fatigue issues in the secondary bracing that had been addressed through a repair program that I had specified and that had extended the bridge's service life by an estimated 30 years. I thought about extension of service life. I thought about the things that extend the useful life of a structure and the things that end it prematurely and the relationship between the two. A bridge fails prematurely when the loads it bears exceed its design capacity and the damage accumulates faster than the maintenance can address it. A structure extends its service life when the loads are within the design capacity and the maintenance is consistent and the specific attention is paid to the elements that carry the most load and are therefore most vulnerable to fatigue. Emma had been bearing a load that exceeded what the protection around her was designed to sustain. The maintenance, the protection, the consistent attention that might have extended her life had been insufficient. I did not provide it. Thomas did not provide it. The system that should have provided it failed. This is a thing I carry. I do not carry it as guilt exactly, because guilt is a response to a choice, and I did not know what was happening. But I carry it as awareness, the specific awareness that comes from looking at a structure after a failure and understanding what should have been done differently. The carrying of it is not punishment. The carrying of it is the form that care takes when the person you were caring for is gone. I walked home from the bridge through the summer city. The cafe tables were full. The students were on the grass by the water. The bells of the cathedral were doing what they do in the summer evenings, organizing the city's time with the specific precision of something that has been doing this for 500 years and that has no intention of stopping. I walked through all of it, and I arrived at my apartment, and I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table where I have sat at every significant moment of this account, and I was present with everything that had happened and everything that had not happened and everything that was going to happen from here. Emma is dead. The people who killed her are in prison. The young people she was trying to protect are some of them safer than they would have been. The work she was doing is being continued by Lien Verbeke and by Inspector Devos and by the organizations that took what Emma had built and are building further on it. Thomas is in Brussels doing different work, carrying what he carries. Frank Dierix is in Kortrijk driving his route, keeping the letters Emma wrote him in a box. I am in Ghent looking at bridges. I answered the phone at 20 minutes past 11 on a Wednesday night in February, because I always answer the phone. The call changed everything that came after it. Not in the dramatic sense of change, but in the structural sense, the sense in which a load applied to a structure changes the internal forces in every member of the structure, redistributing the stress in ways that are invisible from the surface, but that are real and that have consequences over time. The load has been applied. The forces have redistributed. The structure is carrying the load. That is the state of things. That is what there is to say. I answered the phone.